Well, there you go. And every $20 bill is a $100 bill.
All right, I can't see the room anymore, but I'm wondering, is everybody ready on that side? You guys hear me there in GB? There we are.
Vice Chair Benoit, yes, we're here. We're ready to start.
All right, let's go ahead and call the meeting to order, and if we can go ahead and go around the room and do our regular introductions.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Paul Avila Associates.
John DeWitt, J. DeWitt Incorporated.
Rita Lou, Radtech.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Jeff Blake with the Metal Finishers Association and Small Business Alliance.
Good morning, Eddie Marquez, Altair Paramount.
Nancy Feldman, Counsel's Office.
Lisa Tanaka, sitting in for Derek Alatorre for Legislative and Public Affairs.
Van Dorn with South Coast AQMD.
Elaine Hill, South Coast AQMD.
Lori Langrell, South Coast AQMD.
Very good. I think we got everybody there. And we'll go to our second item, the approval of the July 14th minutes. Anyone have any questions on the minutes? Not hearing any, I'll look for a motion.
Move approval.
Second.
Is there a second? Okay, I have a motion and a second. Clerk, do we have to call the roll since I'm remote?
You know, in all honesty, I'm not sure, so why don't we just do it?
Okay. We'll err on the side of caution if the clerk could go ahead and call the roll for a vote.
Paul? Aye. Rita?
Aye.
John?
Aye.
David?
Aye.
Jeff?
Aye.
Eddie?
Aye.
That completes the roll. Approved unanimously.
And Benoit, aye. All right, with that, is Derek there for follow-up action items? Or? Oh, Lisa, I'm sorry.
Yep. So in lieu of Derek, I'll give you the follow-up on the action items. So the first action item was to agendize a presentation regarding Rule 219.
Can you get the microphone a little closer? I can barely hear you.
Oh, sorry. I do have a cartoon character voice. So the first item was to agendize a presentation regarding Rule 219 record keeping. And Derek looked into the issue and indicated it's a little bit too early for this presentation, but we'll be looking at the next possible time to schedule that. The next agenda item or action item was to agendize a brief overview of cap and trade, and that will be on the October legislative update, or with the October legislative update, excuse me. And then also, just for all of you, the Clean Air Awards will be on Friday, October 6th, and each of you have a complimentary ticket to attend, and it's going to be at the Biltmore again, and it should be a really great event, so we hope you all be able to make it. If you're interested in attending, you can contact me. Also, I believe an email will be going out, and Lori will provide that information to you. Thank you.
Comment. Mr. Benoit, I know you can't see me, so this is Rita. I have a comment on.
I can see you, but you're only about 4 pixels tall. So yeah,
okay.
But, go ahead and take your comment.
Shorter than usual. Yeah, I wanted to comment on the 219 item and the concern I have on that in light of Rule 1168 adhesives. So 1168 is coming to Stationary Source Committee next Friday, and then it's going to the board in October. And we have already communicated with the staff and provided public comments with our concerns. But it relates to 219 because one of the issues is the added record-keeping requirements, which we are concerned with and we're not in support of. And our reasons are that already there's extensive record keeping under 109. And then most recently with 219 in May, the board gave direction to the staff that they were not in support of adding even more records to this industry. But there was a form, the low VOC material or LVM form, that was required as part of 219, and that's a one-time filing with no fee. So the board approved that, but yet we were promised by staff that we were going to have the form, and the form has not been made available. So the rule does not specify the form, it just specifies the reporting has to be in a format approved by the executive officer. The printing industry requested more outreach on the issue on the of how to report and how these small businesses are going to go about reporting this information, but yet we don't have the form. So I'm really concerned about a new rule that requires even more record keeping for adhesives. Some of these adhesives, I thought the medical device industry was going to be exempt, but they're actually, I found out recently, they're not. And they're manufactured outside California. So we have a lot of concerns about, you know, the promises that have been made by staff to provide clarity, and yet we still don't have this form. So I would say it's since May, I would think it's about time to provide some clarity to the industry on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Rita. Does anyone else have any other comments? Staff have any response for that, or I hope they're taking notes and hopefully can get a response back.
Yes, I've taken extensive notes, and I can follow up with Rita. And
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I have a comment. We generally support Rita's comments on as they pertain to not only 219 but also 1168. And I recognize that staff has has an increased workload now with the passage of AB 617, but there are also still some unfulfilled commitments or promises that the board directed on July 7th to the staff to round out Rule 1147. Most specifically, an implementation document that we provided months before the hearing date. The possibility or the feasibility of using handheld analyzers for the under 1 pound a day facilities to demonstrate every 2 years that they are under a pound a day, as opposed to the alternative, submitting to a costly full-blown source test. That was the specific direction by Board Member Mitchell. And there's several other unfinished items or unfinished business that the regulated community is expecting, rightfully so. I think staff needs to come to grips with this extra workload, but nevertheless, it needs to be accomplished as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else? All right, with that, we'll move on to item number 4, the summary of recent studies of air pollution and health effects.
just press it? Okay. Hi. Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. I'm Joe Kagosh. I'm the Health Effects Officer here at the district, and my presentation is on a selection of recent studies on air pollution and health effects. And I will go ahead and jump into the presentation. I do want to kind of just mention a little bit about kind of what I was trying to present in this presentation. So, obviously health studies are coming out, very frequently. Health studies of air pollution also coming out, quite frequently. There are a lot of health studies out there, and I think what I'm trying to highlight in this particular presentation are some, some really big studies, a handful of really big studies that have occurred in the last year or two. And also I'm going to spend a few slides talking about one of the newer areas of air pollution and health research regarding neurological health outcomes. So in this first slide, I want to kind of distinguish sort of, what some areas that we know in terms of air pollution and health effects. So the EPA has established as causal the links between PM 2.5 and cardiovascular health outcomes. So for example, heart disease, heart attacks, and also mortality from cardiovascular causes. Another causal link has been ozone and respiratory effects. So for example, most notably asthma exacerbations. And there are others, but these are some of the key ones that I want to mention. So, I think a lot of those studies in the past have really answered the question about, does this cause that? And I think, by no means does that mean that we are done studying the health effects of particulate matter. But what I would want to highlight is that the newer studies look at slightly different questions. So rather than looking at whether PM 2.5 causes mortality or not, one of the areas that has been looked at more recently is to look at effects at lower exposures, lower level exposures. Another main area of research regarding PM and mortality is, again, looking at quantifying the impacts. And I'll talk a little bit about two studies that looked at that question. There's a question here. Yes.
Joe K., what is the sample study? How many people are we talking about on these studies? 100,000? Half a million?
It depends on the specific study.
Okay.
So some of them are a couple thousand to a few thousand. Others are in the millions. It just depends on which study it is. So I'm not talking about any one study at this moment.
Okay. And it would be an aggregate. You've extracted an aggregate of all of them, correct? More or less.
No. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the studies individually.
Okay.
Yeah. Another kind of one of the kind of main areas, research areas, has been looking at what we call mechanistic studies. So it's trying to answer the question of, well, how does this cause this health effect? I mentioned that I will be talking a little bit about neurological health studies, and another area that I'm not going to cover today, simply because there's just not enough time to do that, is there's some focus on metabolic diseases. So this includes diabetes and obesity. Okay. So the first study that I wanted to talk about was a study published earlier this year in the New England Journal of Medicine, and this one looked at air pollution and mortality, and specifically they looked at PM 2.5 and ozone levels in the Medicare population, so an elderly population in the United States. And so to answer your question, for this particular study, they included over 60 million patients, Medicare beneficiaries, in this study, and it ranged from the year 2000 to 2012, so people who were enrolled in Medicare during that time period. The key findings from this study was that they found increased mortality from PM 2.5 and ozone, and that is not a new finding per se, but the kind of more interesting part of this study and this study's findings is that they looked at areas where the PM and ozone levels were below what are the current national standards, in other words, the EPA NAAQS standards. They also looked at what populations were experiencing the higher risks, and they found that for PM 2.5 risks, there were higher premature mortality risks among men, among African Americans, and among people with low income.
Joe Kay, I've got a question.
Yes.
This cohort, I guess, of 60 million people, Medicare beneficiaries. I'm a Medicare beneficiary, so. But did these studies take into account, since if they were causal, for smoking and cooking and other things, other contributors like that, as opposed to workers or populations being exposed from diesel from trucks and so on?
Sure. So what I will say is, obviously, and I think there are other factors that are contributing to premature mortality, I think is kind of what you're getting at. And in epidemiologic studies, this is something that's really important to take into account. I think I don't have a copy of that study with me, but I believe they did look at many other factors. And what they do in the statistical models is that they adjust for these other factors that could contribute and could contribute to the outcome that they're looking at, the health outcome, which here is mortality. But there are also, could be correlated with the exposure. So, for example, if people who are living in highly polluted areas are also more likely to be smokers, then they do account for that kind of correlation statistically in the models.
Okay. So there was an accounting for that, and there are more than one factor contributing to.
Right, absolutely. And so how they do it is they have to account for these factors simultaneously, not just one at a time. The second study I wanted to highlight, so this is a mortality study that looked at the impacts of PM 2.5 and ozone pollution globally. So they did it by country. And this is very much in the realm of quantifying the impact of air pollution. This is part of what they call the Global Burden of Disease study. They look at several different factors affecting mortality, and what they found was that PM 2.5 ranked as a fifth most important mortality risk factor in 2005. Why did it rank as a fifth most important factor? Well, they attributed 4.2 million premature deaths, which is about 7.6 of the total global deaths, to PM 2.5. Ozone impacts were a lot less in terms of mortality. This is something that is pretty well quantified in other studies. But what you see of the map is to a certain extent what you would expect, where some of these countries that are in the developing world and have pretty well-known air pollution problems by this point, and also very large populations are experiencing the bulk of the what we call the burden of disease here. Now for us, because we are in the United States, and in California in particular, we also want to look at the estimates of impacts in the United States. So the study done by Cromar through the American Thoracic Society looked at quantifying impacts in the United States. Now, I do want to point out that the American Thoracic Society has recommended standards for PM 2.5 and ozone that are different from the EPA National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So for example, for PM 2.5, the annual standard for EPA is 12 micrograms. The ATS recommended standard is 11 micrograms. Similarly, for ozone, the 8-hour ozone average, the EPA, the 2015 EPA standard is 70 parts per billion. The ATS recommended 8-hour ozone standard is 60 parts per billion. So in each case, it's a little bit lower. Okay. Now these are not enforceable standards; these are their recommendations. But in their analysis, they wanted to look at, well, how does it look when we look at their standards, the ATS standards? So I just wanted to mention that because in some of the other analyses, we really look at the EPA standards because that's the standards that we are tasked to meet. Okay. So for this particular study, they looked at certain areas of the United States, but you can see within California, many of the areas are pretty well covered, including areas within our district. Overall, they found over 9,000 excess deaths in the study areas, again, due to PM 2.5 and ozone above the ATS standards. Okay, and they said, of their study population, California accounted for about 37% of the total health impacts. Now, I do want to mention that when this particular study came out, I think there was a lot of interest from the public in the study, partly because they also released this web tool, this very user-friendly web tool called healthoftheair.org. And on that website, you can type in your area, and then it'll give you an estimate of your area. Now, the area is pretty broad. I think, I typed in, Glendale, which is where I live, and it gave me Los Angeles, Long Beach. So when we say area, it's a fairly large area, and so they can give you an estimate for the kind of area, if you will. Yes, question. Mm-hmm.
Joe K., two things on your example here. The San Joaquin Valley, I mean, that would, for many, many years of crop dusting and all that, that's pretty that can be explained, dust and the soil for many, many years of growing agriculture. That's fair enough. But as you come down to the little red spot, that would seem to be like Calexico, the desert area. How would that, air quality-wise, fall in the red? Because there doesn't seem to be many crops out there except for grapes.
So I don't know that the PM 2.5 levels are necessarily driven by agricultural impacts. Certainly for our region, for our district, it's really driven by mobile sources, emissions from mobile sources, so cars and trucks and other mobile sources, as well as some small fraction contributed by stationary sources. So in our area, it's really mostly traffic driven that causes the highest, in terms of our data, the highest PM 2.5 levels in the Inland Empire areas, particularly around our Mira Loma station. Yeah. Yes. Question.
Is there any difference between the 2.5 in the Central Valley and in the agriculture areas versus the 2.5 here in the San Gabriel Valley? What is how do you measure that health impact?
So I guess in terms of the PM 2.5, so I think there are two things going on here. One is what are the levels of PM 2.5, and I think the second piece is what's the population being affected, right? And so I think certainly population-wise, we have a far more densely populated area compared to the San Joaquin Valley. Although I do know that the San Joaquin Valley, in terms of the levels of PM 2.5, can be pretty high as well. So I think there are kind of two factors kind of working together. Obviously, the highest impacts would be if you had an area that has very high PM 2.5 levels and a very large population being impacted. Obviously, those would be the kind of more highly impacted areas in that sense.
Being non-scientific and fairly incompetent in your area, I'm trying to understand the difference between dust that comes off a farm versus PM 2.5 that comes out of a diesel engine.
Right. So absolutely. So in general, when we think of these, what we call kind of dust, I guess, dust, earth, kind of like earth sources of particulate matter, they tend to be more in the coarse particle fraction, so more like PM10. So, for example, obviously I'm most familiar with the data in our region, but when we look at the Coachella Valley, and where they get a lot of dust storms, and that tends to be a far more agricultural area than the rest of our district, which is more metropolitan. They have much higher PM10 levels, but not necessarily very high PM2.5 levels. PM2.5 tends to be more from combustion sources, so hence engines and so on. Excellent question. Thank you.
Another question.
Yes.
Regarding the excess death conclusion by the author, just in my experience doing modeling and how to determine risk, I just don't understand how you could attribute excess deaths for these type of parameters. And just going through research, you say, okay, I want to have an experiment. It seems like the only way you absolutely attribute a death to some type of causation would be to have one population exposed to that and another population that lives identically not exposed to it, and say the excess is only attributed to the difference. How do you actually come up with some estimate for excess death?
Right. So, so basically, I think this is an excellent point, and I think there are a lot of nuances when it comes to this kind of modeling. Absolutely. I think in general, the process, if you will, is to take kind of estimates of the association first, to look at what we call a concentration response function. In other words, how much of the exposure, in this case air pollution, would cause what percentage change, for example, in risk, or percentage increase in risk, right? And that may be different for different studies. They will look at the kind of landscape of studies to do that evaluation, and also of course evaluate each study for the quality of their data, right? And I think in general, obviously we would want to use the best quality data or better quality data wherever possible. For some links, for example, for some areas, you may have a lot of evidence for there being an association, that this seems to cause that, but there may be a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the estimate of how big of an impact does it have, how big of a risk change does it have. Okay, that becomes a little bit more problematic, and then it gives you a much wider estimate in terms of your estimated impact. In some other areas, you have a lot more consistency, where you can actually estimate to a reasonable confidence, although of course there's always a range, right? To a much higher confidence, what the impact is.
Is there some type of quantification the author has come up with as far as the confidence interval statistically on how accurate their estimate may be based on the assumptions they've made?
Yes. So oftentimes that is published. In some of the estimates, for example, that we have looked at in the past, there is sort of like a middle, a best estimate, and then the range, right? A low and a high. I'd have to go back and look at this particular study to see if they actually publish the range. Oftentimes what they will do is what they call a sensitivity analysis. So looking at, well, if I kind of change these assumptions again to within, a reasonable expected range, how does that affect my final result? So
That type of information would be helpful, especially for decision makers, to say something as definitive as 9,000 excess deaths, but it'd be nice to have the qualifier of the accuracy of the studies plus or minus whatever. I think is very helpful.
Okay.
So thank you.
Sure, we'll do. Okay. Then the next slide, I'm going to talk about two studies here. So, yes, sorry.
Joe, okay, a couple of questions. One, I've only got an old master's degree. Heterogeneity, what does that mean?
So that means that it differs from study to study, for example.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Secondly, going from study to study, let's say your point of information, let's say you're going to use for air visits to a hospital room. okay, for example,
Mhm.
because that data can be collected.
Right.
Now, after you've extrapolated everything like a heart attack, obesity, all these different types of issues, then you get a raw number. So let's use that raw number and formulate hospital visits, and we'll associate that with, let's say, air pollution, okay? Now, percentage-wise, and since we're going down the extrapolation highway, let me see if I phrase this right, would that be a fair study of visits from a hospital room, and not Medicare patients, because like Bill, I'm on Medicare too, but not just, let's say, 65 and under, and then 65 and over. Is that a valid study for air purposes?
I mean, I think, I think what you just described there is, like a potential framework for a study. And I think, it's going to be really hard for me to say, yay or nay. I think there are a lot of other factors. I think, when you sit down and design a study, you have to look at a number of things. You have to look at what your population is. You have to look at the quality of the data that's available. In some areas, there's, some very great quality data, and other areas, not so much, right? You have to kind of recognize the limitations of your data. You also have to look at, what is the particular study question that you are trying to answer, and is that data suitable to answer that question, right? So I think, unfortunately, the answer here is really it depends.
Right.
Could you design a study like that? Potentially. Depends on what you're trying to answer, and depends on the very specifics of your population and your data.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to talk about this, the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, which has a neat acronym called MESA. And in particular, there is a portion of the MESA study called the MESA Air study that looked specifically at air pollution impacts on atherosclerosis. Now, atherosclerosis means the hardening of the arteries. In particular, they are, and we should all be interested in looking at the hardening of the arteries that bring blood to the heart. Of course, this would be a very important risk factor for heart disease and heart attacks. And atherosclerosis is a risk factor for kind of future heart disease. Now, one of the areas that this particular study looked at was to look at markers of atherosclerosis, again, the hardening of the arteries, as it progresses over time. And the way that they were able to do that was to establish a long-term cohort study, or sometimes called a follow-up study, where they kind of tracked people and kind of kept track of them over time. And in this case, they tracked them for 10 years. This study spanned 6 different metropolitan areas of the United States, and one of the sites was LA County. That part was run through UCLA. They looked at long-term exposures to PM 2.5, NOx, and black carbon, and in fact, they actually did quite a lot of work in terms of characterizing each participant's air pollution exposure. So the long-term monitoring certainly was a part of it. They did some community-based monitoring. They also looked at indoor sources, which is not something that we typically look at here at AQMD. They also did some personal monitoring, so where the participants would wear a monitor for a certain period of time and looking at their exposures during that time period. Now, as far as our kind of existing knowledge, there are already a whole host of studies that have looked at air pollution and heart disease. In particular, we've seen studies that indicate that air pollution can trigger heart attacks, stroke, and other cardiovascular diseases. So what is the added value of this particular study? Again, because they were able to follow people over time, they were interested in looking at, well, how quickly does this progress over time? And does air pollution affect how quickly atherosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries, progresses over time? They looked specifically at coronary artery calcification. Again, that's the calcium buildup, which is a component of plaque in the arteries, coronary arteries, again, the arteries that bring the blood to the heart. quite an important artery, I might add. What they found in this study was that the increased air pollution levels were associated with basically accelerating the rate of calcification. So the calcium buildup was faster in those people who are more highly exposed to air pollution. So again, this one is kind of looking at the rate and also trying to look at the mechanism, right? So is this the mechanism by which air pollution is linked to cardiovascular disease? So again, this is kind of one of the kind of key findings from this study. This is a different study, not looking at heart disease. This is looking at lung cancer patients. In particular, looking at survival among people who have been diagnosed with lung cancer. So they included over 350,000 patients, lung cancer patients, in their study, diagnosed over a range of years, only in California. And they looked at the concentrations at the homes of these patients. They looked at several of the criteria pollutants. And the key finding from this study that was conducted out of USC was that the higher air pollution exposures after the lung cancer diagnosis, in fact, shortened the survival. But in particular, now, lung cancer, there are many different forms of lung cancer. Some forms, obviously, as with any cancer, the earlier you're diagnosed, the earlier stages you're diagnosed, the more treatable the cancer is. Right. There are also specifically different types of lung cancer. There's one type called small cell lung cancer that is particularly deadly. The other types, which are very conveniently called non-small cell lung cancer, tend to be more treatable. And what they found was that for this, looking at kind of the link between air pollution and lung cancer survival, is that you saw more of an impact of air pollution for those people who were diagnosed at early stages or who had non-small cell lung cancer. In other words, the more treatable forms. So in this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the newer areas of research in terms of air pollution and health, which is neurological impacts. So, yes, question? Mm-hmm.
In your collection of data, is there a difference in the numbers that have been correlated from, let's say, the American Lung Association, the Asthma Association, the Thoracic Association, American Heart Association, workers' compensation boards, and I hate to say this, but the cigarette and tobacco industry, because they keep their own numbers. Is there a difference in all these associations when it comes to, let's say, lung and respiratory problems and a correlation to air pollution? Are all the numbers different in your studies?
You mean the studies that I'm presenting today, or just overall? I haven't looked, I haven't particularly, looked into the, funding sources or the sponsors of the studies. That's not part of an assessment that I've ever, partaken in. So I have to say, I don't know the answer to that question.
And I don't want to throw you a curveball or knuckleball, but it would seem that the numbers would vary from each one of them. And you said a key point right now, whoever's funding them. Because if, let's say, you're funded by the American Asthma Association and a high roller's behind it, well, those numbers got to reflect something. Okay. And do your studies, can you pull the numbers out, so to speak? And that's, I just don't know that. I personally don't know that because the numbers are too overwhelming for me.
Sure. I mean, I think, as with our work in government, we do expect transparency in science and reproducibility of results. And so, the mechanism of science and the structure that is set up in terms of peer review of scientific articles, and again, the sharing of data when it's shareable, and again, reproducing each other's results, and also looking at not just looking at one study to draw all your conclusions from, but looking at multiple studies from different populations and different regions and slightly different study designs. I think that is, the kind of the process by which you try to, eliminate biases that could have occurred in any one particular or handful of studies.
Thank you.
So talking about neurological effects, the neurological effects, again, think of it as like nervous system effects, right? So that really encompasses a whole range of health outcomes. Now, one of the areas that has been looked at by a number of studies, but again, still, very much within the realm of emerging evidence, is looking at autism in children, and specifically because autism is a condition that tends to be diagnosed relatively at a relatively young age. And the understanding in the scientific community now is that the risk factors for autism and the things that influence autism, the development of autism, most likely occur when during the pregnancy. In fact, so basically when the child is still in utero. So you can see a lot of these studies look at the exposures either in early life or during development, in utero. In my own research, also, so I've not done research in autism, but I've done research looking at prenatal exposures. There is certainly a lot of interest and a lot of focus on the timing of the exposures. So, for example, if you're exposed in the first trimester versus the second or third trimester, that could make a difference because the fetus is in different developmental stages during those times. So. But basically, just a summary is that these are some things that people have looked at. They looked at proximity to freeways, where you have like a particular mixture of air pollutants. They also looked at I think one study looked at proximity to industry, and certainly again a lot of focus on the timing of the exposures. Okay. So there's another kind of group of neurological effects, which are called cognitive effects. So this includes looking at impacts on IQ scores, on reasoning skills, other kind of markers of cognitive function. So again, this is looking at different things in different populations. So among children, there have been studies that have linked air pollution to lower IQ scores or some detrimental effects on reasoning skills. Among adults, typically they tend to study older adults. In this particular study, they looked at verbal learning performance and worsened cognitive function. In young people, they looked at something called sustained attention decrease. And there are other studies kind of, that are sort of, roughly wrapped into this realm of cognitive effects. So there have been, like I said, just, really just a handful of studies, trying to figure out whether air pollution has these links. So another group of neurological diseases are called neurodegenerative diseases, a very long word. And this encompasses kind of most notably Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. Obviously, with our generally aging population, these types of diseases are becoming more common, simply because age is a very dominant risk factor when it comes to the risk of neurodegenerative diseases. I see some finger pointing around the room. So, okay.
Testing. Okay. Now, I'm under the impression that the short-term PM exposure, wasn't that due to, let's say, somebody worked at, let's say, I picked grapes for 20 years and DDT came over me, and then I stopped and changed careers. And then I worked in an office. Now, when I'm 65, then all of a sudden all these diseases came in that were related to what happened 40 years ago. Or I was a steel worker and involved in those big steamy hot plants and all the bad things that happened to my skin, but not till later on. What would the factor be in that situation as far as short-term and a time measurement of those illnesses manifesting, but really due to environmental issues, not the air quality per se.
Right. So as far as looking at kind of pretty significant past exposures, I think this is something that tends to be more difficult, certainly more difficult to look at. I think for well-designed studies, they do tend to ask questions about kind of, again, major impacts, right? So for example, let's take smoking as a good example, right? If somebody had quit smoking 20 years ago, the answer to are you a smoker may be no, right? Okay, but then a well-designed study would also ask about smoking history, right? So again, these are questions that that can be asked if a study is able to survey all their participants. In some cases, they also do data linkages, for example. So if they have databases that would, for example, if you're talking about a particular type of occupational exposure, they may have databases of rosters of folks who had worked in certain high-risk occupations, for example, and they could do data linkages to kind of look at whether that person had been working in that industry and perhaps how long. So, okay. But as far as some of these short-term exposures, oftentimes the short-term exposures, they look at kind of day-to-day variations, so 24, like a 24-hour period, 24-hour averages. And in this particular study, the one in the middle bar there, they looked at patients who already had neurodegenerative diseases and looked at mortality among just that population. So not looking at this is not talking about developing dementia. It's talking about mortality among people who have dementia and other neurodegenerative diseases. Okay. So again, just one or two studies, again, very much in the area of emerging evidence. These studies have linked air pollution to an increased risk of a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and also the one at the bottom looking at ALS, which is probably more commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So as a summary of kind of where some of these studies have gone when it comes to looking at air pollution and neurological effects, again, there are studies that have linked air pollution to decreases in memory, attention, and cognitive function. They're looking at prenatal exposures linking to autism and cognitive issues in children. And also a study linking air pollution to risk of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so just as a final summary slide of this presentation, again, it seems that based on some of these recent studies, they show that air pollution continues to have significant health impacts, especially the studies that have looked at the increased mortality at levels below the current federal standards, and looking at California, the U.S., and around the world. And we have some very recent studies that suggest links to air pollution to shortened lung cancer survival, faster progression of heart disease, again, specifically the calcification of the arteries, and also to certain neurological effects. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you for the presentation. Quick summary question, kind of just doing my thesis. Just had a question as far as when you review papers from other researchers, is it something when you look at a certain paper, are you looking for other documents, other papers that may contradict what the author is saying? How do you validate that this is a good study and you're keeping a broad mind as far as anything that's out there to validate what the author is concluding?
Right. So as far as validating their conclusions, again, I think in the sense that we don't draw all our conclusions from any one study, and so even though I am in this presentation highlighting a few specific studies and kind of walking through some of the key findings from each of these studies, that is certainly not to say that we should draw our conclusions from that study, right, or from even these 5 studies that I've highlighted. As far as evaluating the quality, this is something that that researchers have done in systematic ways. We call them either a meta-analysis, if it's a quantitative analysis, or a systematic review, which tends to be more of a qualitative analysis. And in those studies, they outline very specific criteria ahead of time before they do the final review of those studies. This is something that I have done in the past. I haven't done it for air pollution studies, but I've done it for other types of health studies. And basically, there is a almost like a grading system, right? That you look at, the certain markers of quality of those studies. Some of the studies may not even meet your minimum criteria to be included in the review. For those studies that meet the minimum criteria, there could still be a stratification of kind of like, medium quality and high quality, right? And so what you do in those types of review, like kind of large review studies where you start with like, hundreds or thousands of articles and you kind of try to summarize what they all say together, is that you kind of limit it to what you would consider kind of acceptable, to do the more detailed review. You do the detailed review, and then you kind of look at what differences you see, and perhaps why you see these differences. Sometimes you may see differences based on different age groups that they studied. Sometimes you may see differences because there were some meta-analysis that showed differences by latitude, basically where geographically those people were living that participated in those particular studies. So again, sometimes there are reasons for the heterogeneity, and other times it's just like it tends to be kind of within a certain range, and you can show where the studies fall in the range and what the sort of middle value is. Bill.
Yeah, I guess to build off of David's question, I think one of the takeaways that I have here from your presentation is that in every study, you have a multiplicity of opinions or views as far as causal factors, and like particulate. In the final analysis here, your objective is to write a regulation, write a rule, and reduce emissions from one or multiple sources in the interest of public health. But since you do have multiple studies and a number of causal factors involved, how is the decision made, and is it made by you? I don't mean you personally, but the district, or maybe even OHIA, to accept one study over another, or one group of studies over others? Is that based on the pursuit of your objective? When I say your objective, the district's objective, a mission statement, or is it does it take into consideration to what extent other factors that you can't regulate might influence that? There are some things like, for particulate, sea spray, smoking, some dust, wildfires, and things like that, versus diesel trucks or mobile sources on the streets. So I guess where I'm going with that, who makes that decision to accept some studies and go with that and reject other studies who that might be very valid?
So as far as standard setting, obviously the EPA is tasked with setting the standards for the criteria pollutants, and so they are also the agency that reviews the science in the setting of those standards, right? So the AQMD, is not tasked with doing that assessment and setting that standard. We are, of course, then tasked with meeting that standard and developing the plans, but that's kind of separate, right? That's different. As far as toxics goes, that falls to OEHA in terms of reviewing the science, making that determination in terms of including it on the various lists of air toxics and for their agency, applicable to work for other agencies. So toxics that tend to be water contaminants, for example. And the OEHA is also the agency that establishes the guidelines for risk assessment, which the district then adopts in our work. So I think, the short answer, I guess, as far as rule development goes, is that, we are not tasked with doing these kind of broad assessments of the science to set those standards, but we do rely on other scientific other scientific agencies to be doing that work and to be quantifying the risk or to be setting standards in that regard.
First of all, I thoroughly enjoy this. I love this stuff, especially in our business. We need to know this. I want to ask you two questions. Your full email isn't on here, just your name, and I'd like to get it before you leave because I'd like to get some of these studies. And lastly, just an open-ended question from your experience. With these nasty hurricanes that have been coming around as far as air pollution, is there a way to, let's say, segregate the actual air and the issues of the air volatility without the debris and the devastation, and actually maybe get a measurement on that? Is that possible?
So as far as the hurricanes go, I honestly hadn't thought of that as a potential air pollution issue or something that impacts air pollution. Generally speaking, when you've got winds of 185 miles per hour, air pollution is certainly not your top concern.
Right. Right. You're right. Correct.
So, and even if we do want to think of it in the context of air pollution, that is what we call a very good dispersion factor. So it will blow away a lot of I would even hazard to say, all of the air pollution or most of the air pollution in that area when you've got winds from a hurricane. Now, as far as the aftermath of a hurricane, when you're talking about sort of the recovery and the cleanup and whatnot, obviously I think many of the top issues are with safety, with water-related contamination and mold issues. Now, can that at some level affect the air pollution? Potentially, thankfully, I would say in our region, hurricanes are not a concern. We got other natural disasters, earthquakes and whatnot, but I am grateful to not be living in a hurricane area.
Okay, if that's the last question, we'll go ahead and move on to the next item. The truck study.
Good
Thank
morning.
you for a very good presentation there. I had one more question. I didn't quite see the last presentation in my email, so if we could get that presentation emailed out to all of us, if it wasn't, and that'd be great. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So following up on a whole slew of studies we just talked about, we have another study to talk about because we are a science-based organization. We like our numbers and our science and our technical analyses. So I just want to do a quick presentation here. This one I don't think will have to be as in-depth as the last one. It's a little bit, not a little bit, it's a lot more narrowly focused. So we wanted to provide just a quick summary of the warehouse truck trip study that our agency undertook and helped to fund with a couple other organizations. So just a very quick bit of background. This is a long-running area of focus for the agency of looking at warehouses and looking at what is, kind of the air quality impact of warehousing on our area. And so, back in the early 2000s, we did some look in Mira Loma at the growth of warehousing that was starting to occur there. Followed that up in 2005, the Western Riverside Council of Governments, they published their Good Neighbors Guidelines of trying to look at how, what are some good practices for warehouse siting and trying to avoid, queuing of trucks and that sort of thing, and these land use proximity concerns that had been arising. We had definitely a key role in developing those guidelines. We then, kind of fast forward a few years, started our own study looking at truck trip rates, and how many trucks go to individual warehouses, and how do you determine that when a new warehouse is being proposed. And so we started looking at this in 2012. We did a whole variety of traffic counts ourselves at individual warehouses, lots of visits to facilities, business surveys, stakeholder working groups, a very concerted effort. Ultimately, where we ended up was we actually reached out to ITE, and they're the Institute of Transportation Engineers. They're the primary organization of traffic engineers and transportation engineers in the country that develops trip rates and does traffic studies and provides guidance on traffic studies. And so we partnered with NEIOP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Trade Group, to co-fund a study to take the work that we had begun and merge it with some other data and have ITE sort of take this to the next step. So I wanted to kind of summarize what came out of that whole process. So here on slide 3, looking at, why even study a truck trip rate? Well, what is a truck trip rate? And this is really, it's the number of truck trips per 1,000 square feet of warehouse, and it's a ratio. And the reason we're looking at this is that there's really been this massive growth of warehousing, particularly in the Inland Empire over the last 10, 15, 20 years. In the last few years, we're adding about 15 to 20 million square feet of new warehousing every single year. And that trend is, there's no sign of slowing that. Quick question?
Yes, thank you, Ian. So have you or has the district looked into why the increase
In warehousing?
Uh-huh.
Oh, certainly. And so I think that a lot of it is tied to the growth in trade, right? So if we look at the trade volumes, for example, down at the ports of LA and Long Beach, there was a very large growth, particularly in the 2000s, when, after China joined the WTO, and you have containerization of all of the goods and a few other things going on, all in the late 90s, early 2000s, you see this very rapid growth at the ports, and then all those goods have to go somewhere, right? And so what we saw was that land is considerably cheaper in the Inland Empire than it is in LA County, and so you get this real explosion of warehousing out in the Inland Empire, and that trend has continued. There's some nuances in it in that, today, there's more of an emphasis on larger structures compared to some of the smaller ones that were being built in the mid-2000s. And so there's still a lot of development today where you might get 500,000 to 1 million square foot buildings as opposed to 50,000 square foot to 100,000 square foot. So the style of development has been changing through time, but a lot of it has been that growth in trade volume.
Just to follow up on that, and thank you, because I actually commented as part of the Rule 1168 public comments that the CEQA analysis in 1168 should consider the impact on goods movement. And just from a practical perspective, I'll tell you what's been happening in our industry. As manufacturing has moved out of the basin, what people are doing is they're manufacturing goods outside the state or outside of the basin, and then either shipping those in or trucking them in. And China's a perfect example. A lot of our manufacturers went to move their operations to China. And my contention in the 1168 analysis is that if you make policies here that are inhospitable to industry, what the market is going to do is rather than fill out the forms and hire 3 more people to fill out all the forms that are required in that particular rule, for example. What they're going to do is they're going to move out of the Southern California area, assemble the product elsewhere, glue it elsewhere in the case of the adhesives rule, and then they're going to ship in or truck in a fully manufactured product and thereby increase goods movement. And I've never seen that type of analysis done in the rule, but just from a practical perspective, that's basically what's happening.
And I know we have our CEQA manager here, and I'm sure she's listening to your comments. But I think just in general, if we look at this particular study, didn't really, look at that broad scale shifting of trade, shifting of manufacturing. There's certainly a lot of reasons why manufacturing shifts from country to country. You look at labor rates, you look at cost of transportation, you look at automation, environmental regulation, a whole slew of reasons why manufacturing and trade flows one way or the other. So certainly that is one of, I think, many considerations, the point that you're raising. To get back to this, because I know time is precious here, and there's another presentation after mine. So just quickly on these trip rates, one of the key issues that we've run into when we look at these new warehouses as they're being proposed and developed through the CEQA process is often a tenant isn't known for a warehouse when it goes through the entitlement process. And so without a tenant, it's hard to know the specific operational profile. How many trucks are going to go to a 1 million square foot building? It really depends. And so what is the appropriate rate to use? How do you estimate air quality impacts or maybe other impacts if you don't have a good sense of the trip rate? So there are these default trip rates that have been published by various entities that are out there. And the reason that we're really focused on this from an air quality standpoint is that trucks, we know, are the largest source of nitrogen oxides in the basin. NOx is really the key pollutant when it comes to ozone and particulate matter. And when we look at warehousing, trucks are about 90% of the NOx or more from these warehouse projects. So it's really this trip rate is kind of a first order determinant. How many trucks are there is going to be really a key determinant for looking at the pollutants from a warehouse.
Ian, a question of when you say a truck trip, that's a round trip.
In this instance, we talk about one-way trips. A trip in and a trip out would be 2 trips.
That's 2 trips.
That's the standard how it's counted here. Yeah.
Ian, enlighten me here. Somebody's going, let's say Amazon, because they're looking for 10 million square foot warehouse and 10,000 jobs somewhere in this country. But let's say they find one in the Inland Empire. Isn't the technology today good enough? So Amazon builds a building. I'm sure they're going to have enough air purifiers, air conditioning, whoever designs it to make it so efficient because Amazon's good at what they do. So there really isn't going to be a need for it per se, an SCAQMD study inside of the warehouse. And let's say that, and I'm not a land planner, but if I were to build a big warehouse, I'd want to put it next to a railroad spur to load the goods to come back into the marketplace. So trucking-wise, it would be minimal. There'd still be trucks, obviously, but not fleets of them like there was in the old days. But isn't the technology good enough? So they're really, I'm trying to say this right, isn't a lot of air pollution inside of these gigantic warehouses versus outside, in your opinion?
You bring up an interesting question. So typically when we're looking at these air quality studies and the CEQA context, and we're looking at nitrogen oxides, the concern isn't usually about the impact, the direct impact of those nitrogen oxide emissions on the inside of the building and the workers right there. There certainly are concerns about diesel particulate matter and cancer risks, and localized impacts from that. But the tough thing about it is if you look at where a lot of these warehouses are located, they're in the Inland Empire, and our largest ozone impacts and particulate matter impacts from secondary formation of pollutants in the atmosphere as nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds react in the atmosphere with sunlight. Most of those impacts are actually in the Inland Empire. And if you look at something like ozone, most air filters don't reduce ozone, indoor air filters. Most filters will actually address particulate matter if those filters actually exist in the building and they're being used appropriately and all that. So if you imagine, well, ozone is kind of the biggest problem in the Inland Empire. Indoor levels, it would not be surprising that they would be very similar to outdoor levels. And it's not directly tied to the truck that's outside, but the whole universe of trucks that are in the basin and all the other sources of NOx would be a contributor. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide here, slide 4. Just a quick a few tidbits on our study that we kind of try to evaluate a whole variety of different warehouses, and we started with a universe of about 400 warehouses. We did some business surveys, then we went to individual warehouses and about 37 of them, and started collecting trip rates from all of these. And the number I want to point out here, because it'll come up again later, is that there's a default trip rate put out by ITE, it's shown on the middle of the slide here, of 0.64 trucks per 1,000 square feet. And that's a default that, without knowing anything else other than the size of the building, that's a default rate that's out there. And what we found is that there's a lot of variability around that number. Getting back to some of the questions from this earlier presentation about the variability in results, that we're finding the high variability here. So we did go to ITE, AQMD and NAOP both contributed about $25,000 to ITE to collect as much data that they could from our study and others to see what they could do with it. ITE convened its own panel of experts. They led this study, and it had a whole variety of different people that, with expertise that they pulled from, including NAOP and ourselves, but also mostly from others from ITE, academia, and professionals in the industry. And they tried to compile all the available data that's out there. And one of their key things was trying to see, well, a warehouse is not a warehouse is not a warehouse, and seeing can they categorize them in different ways and that make sense, and see if, well, those categories, can you find different trip rates that sort of get rid of some of this variability and make a little bit more sense. I want to very quickly kind of talk about the 5 different categories that they have here on slide 6. They're shown up here: transload, short-term storage, cold storage, fulfillment center, and parcel hub. If we look at a transload facility, this is one that they designated up on the screen. This is actually a Target facility, the company Target in Fontana, and you see the shape of this building is a little unique in that it has sort of a big, large rectangle and then a small one coming off, making the shape of an L. And transload is another word we sometimes hear as crossdock. And so the idea is that you have these long, skinny buildings that a truck goes into one side of the building, drops its load, and that load immediately goes to the other side of the building to a different truck. And maybe you have 100 soccer balls come in on one side, 10 go to 10 different trucks, right, on the other side. And there's no storage on racks inside the building. It's really just one side of the building to the other. That's the idea of transload or crossdock. Very, very short-term storage. And so you see this building, it has that sort of long, skinny edge there that thought, well, maybe that is sort of a transload. And from space, or an airplane shot, that's kind of what it looks like. It turns out when you go in that building, that's actually not a crossdock. The inside of that building is, that's actually just their conveyance system, that they have some conveyors that are in there that distribute goods from the larger rectangle to trucks through that conveyance system. So it's not actually a crossdock operation at all. But from maps and everything else and going through CEQA entitlement, it might look like it would be a crossdock. So there's some complications that arise immediately on trying to look at these classifications. We look at a short-term storage. This is typically what people think about for a distribution center warehouse in the Inland Empire. Long, skinny buildings, with goods that go in and get stored for days to weeks at a time. Usually not much more than that, and then come in on trucks and go out on trucks. Cold storage is a slightly different animal. What's shown here is what you'll see on the roofs of these is a lot of air handling equipment, and this is all for the refrigeration that's going on. What tends to happen in cold storage facilities is you tend to get much higher turnover, that the goods cannot stay for weeks, right? You don't want a banana to sit around for a month. Those come in and out really quickly, so you tend to get much higher truck trip rates at cold storage kind of facilities. There aren't as many of these as other types, but these are around. Fulfillment center, this is also e-commerce. I think someone mentioned Amazon earlier. This is the Amazon facility out near the San Bernardino Airport. What's unique about some of these e-commerce facilities, and this is really a new trend in the industry for these kinds of facilities, you see a very large employee parking lot here. There tends to be more hands touching goods inside these facilities than at other kinds of warehouses, and so you get a higher employee count here. A lot of pick and pack of people, moving one thing into another. We actually, when we took trip counts here, it was rather interesting. It was purposefully, we took a count on the Tuesday after Black Friday, just to see worst case, right? We just to get a sense. What does it really look like from Amazon, the big Amazon dealer in the LA area? What was really most impressive was we took video camera counts, so you could actually get a full 24-hour video recording, and we saw that it was more like a sports event of there was there are traffic cops out there shut down the road essentially and directing people in and all the employees to come in, just because there's so many people that had to come in. They're running 3 shifts and it's thousands of employees, and it was a really impressive operation how they're running it. The trucks are obviously running as well, but it's a different, unique kind of operation. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you before you continue, in your research, will there be any more refrigeration warehouses in the works or planned, or that's the last of the Mohicans, the refrigerated warehouses?
We'll see them here and there. They certainly are a small part of the market, but they're out there.
Sure,
as new grocery, chains kind of come in and out of the Southern California market. There's some that are coming along, but not many.
Yeah, how do you account for the variability in the efficiency of the tractors that are being used? Anything from a 400,000-mile tractor to some new hybrid.
Yeah, it's a great question. That's also changing through time, right? As you look at the various regulations that are out there from A or B. So, for example, the truck and bus rule requires that by 2023, all trucks rather need to have a 2010 engine or equivalent in them, and so we do see a change in the fleet through time. The Air Resources Board has put out a model called MVAC. It's a standard model that everybody uses to look at the emissions based on a fleet profile that they've developed, their best guess of what the fleet's going to look like through time, and so that's a standard model that everybody tends to use. The final warehouse I did want to highlight here, again, this is another one that there's not a lot of growth of this, similar to cold storage, but it is out there, and it's a unique kind of facility, and this is a parcel hub. So this particular one here is a FedEx facility, and you see that it has a different kind of shape to it. It has these little arms kicking off of it, but again, very, very high truck rates. You can imagine from a FedEx or UPS or something like that, where their whole business is not storage, their business is transportation. So there are these different kinds of facilities. When we compile all the data together, this is from the ITE's work. When they looked at the transload and the short-term storage, they didn't really find any difference between those two data sets. And so they combined those two together, and you find that those were 91 sites that they compiled together. That's nationwide. Most of those are here in California, though, including the 37 that were part of our study. And they find an overall trip rate, and overall means cars plus trucks, of 1.43 trips per 1,000 square feet, but the truck rate of 0.45, and that's the average. Again, compare that to the 0.64 that I mentioned earlier. That's on the bottom of this table. They found a slightly lower. It's lower than what was found before, but higher than some other estimates that are out there by some other studies. So this is the average that they found from their most recent work. You see that these other facilities, cold storage, e-commerce, and parcel hub, those have substantially higher rates, but it's also statistics of small numbers. There's not as many facilities there that were investigated. The one other point I want to make is that there is a lot of variability in this data. I don't need to go through the details of this. Anybody who's looked at a graph before and sees a shotgun blast pattern knows that there's not a whole lot of correlation in here. And really what this is a warehouse is not a warehouse is not a warehouse. There's a lot of variability in this data, and the operations change a lot between these. And, when we look at this and we say, okay, well, we can come up with an average number. We know there's a lot of variability, that the design of this study wasn't really set up to look at the variability. It did the best it could with the data it has, but, probably the right way to do this is to do some longer term studies rather than go one day at a time, maybe do an entire year at a facility and see how does it change through the seasons, through time, try to tease out some more of this variability. So I think what we're trying to do is to maybe see how we can advance this effort and looking at some of the more of this variability. There's a few other studies that are going on that might help a little bit with this. Riverside County Transportation Commission, they've initiated a new study looking at the logistics industry, trying to get at trip rates. This is more for their transportation mitigation fees. SCAG is also doing their own study of looking at warehousing and warehousing growth, and what does that look like over the next few decades. And then the California Freight Advisory Committee, they've also set a goal for the state to improve the efficiency of freight. Now, the metrics they've used are the value of goods relative to the tons of carbon dioxide, and they're hoping for a 25% increase of that efficiency by 2030, and that could also affect trip rates. So finally, I think where we are right now, ITE is going to take this study and put this in their next edition of their handbook. Their current edition is the 9th edition. The 10th edition is coming shortly. It's actually in the mail to us right now, an advanced copy. We're very eager to see what they say in there. But what we're recommending right now is to continue to use the ITE, but we need to keep pursuing this variability to try to understand it, and it has some real implications, in particular for air quality analyses. And with that, I'll end my presentation.
Thank you, Ian. Good presentation. Quick question, just 20,000-foot overview as far as trying to reduce emissions for AQMP related matters. Just the warehousing traffic, do you know what percentage of the inventory that would account for?
You're not the first person to ask that. It's a very good question. We're asking it internally. We're working on it. We don't have a good number right now, but we're working on it. And it's a little tough on double counting. How much do you assign to the supermarket versus the warehouse versus the port versus the rail yard? So it's a complicated answer, but we are working on that. The one thing I should say on reducing emissions, we're talking a lot about trucks, and one of the big things we're trying to do is how do we get cleaner trucks? And warehousing industry is really a key stakeholder in this, of trying to figure out how do we get cleaner trucks on the road. So, yeah.
In your studies, what percentage of the warehousing in general is just manufacturing? Not quick goods or not refrigeration, where let's say they'll assemble parts and ship them to the market, percentage-wise?
For our study, we were really trying to only look at warehousing and not look at any manufacturing. There is sometimes some very light assembly that occurs at warehousing, but that's not really kind of manufacturing in the traditional sense. So we were really trying to look only at warehousing. In Southern California, it's about 1 billion square feet of warehousing here that is not manufacturing. Okay, thank you.
All right, very good. Any other questions? Not hearing any. I'd ask, could we potentially postpone the next item to the next meeting? Is there anyone that really wanted to hear this meeting? If not, I'd ask if we could go ahead and maybe wait till the next meeting to hear the 1401. Any objections?
It sounds like the speaker said that that's okay too.
Okay, great. With that, we'll move on to the written reports are attached. Is there any other business? Or any questions on the written reports, rather?
On other business, this is John DeWitt. May I ask, there was a meeting of the permitting program, I think, a couple days ago. Permit streamlining, and as that's a pretty integral part of small businesses getting permits through.
Sure.
Do we have can we have on the agenda for the next meeting a status report where all that stuff stands?
Sure, I'm sure Lockie would be happy to come down and give us a quick update on that in the next meeting.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any other business? All right. With that, any public comment there? don't have any here, and thank you all for putting up with me being remote today. I have a couple meetings here in Wildemar starting at 1 that I've got to get to, and so this allows me to take care of both with that. So thank you, and thank you to staff for setting us up so we can do this remotely today. And with that, we'll move to our next meeting date. Will be October 13th at 11:30. And for anyone that's ever interested, if you're near Wildemar during one of these meetings, you can meet here too. Also, we'll just watch the agendas, either my meeting location or Janice's meeting location. We can start doing these remotes if that's closer for you. I'm not sure if it helps anyone, but if it's also available for any one of the members that wants to meet there instead. All right, with that, we'll move to adjournment. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good to see you.